I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are at a live music show.
Okay.
But you're not just, standing in a crowded arena watching some guys play guitars on a stage.
Right, not your typical gig.
Exactly. Instead, the moment the first note hits, you are physically melting into this completely designed spatial environment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the music isn't just coming at you from some big PA system in front. It's actively wrapping around your body, and the lighting is behaving like this liquid organism, and your entire geometric sense of the room is just it's being completely rewritten in real time.
I mean, that is just a total manipulation of reality, isn't it?
It really is.
You're no longer just a spectator who bought a ticket to hear some tracks. You're an active participant stepping inside an architecture that is built entirely out of sound and light.
And today, we're going to figure out exactly how a band from the 1960s engineered that specific spatial illusion.
Yeah, it's a fascinating journey.
We're diving into this phenomenal April 2026 column. It's from Monumental Movement Records, or MMR, and it's titled Pink Floyd, The Expansion of Rock That Reconstructed the World with Sound and Space.
Such a great piece.
Right, and our mission for this deep dive is, well, we're bypassing the standard biography stuff. We want to extract the mechanical, the psychological, and the architectural turning points, the things that allowed this group to transform rock from just a visceral performance into an immersive three-dimensional environment.
It really is a masterclass in synthesis when you think about it.
Totally.
Because what the MMR piece does so well is demonstrate how this evolution wasn't just about writing better songs.
Right.
It was this rigorous, often really chaotic collision of sound manipulation, emerging analog technology, and just, heavy philosophical staging. They essentially drafted the blueprint for what live music could physically be.
Yeah, and to really understand how they got to those massive, hyper-designed stadium environments later on, we have to look at the genesis of this illusion.
In the early days.
Exactly. We're in 1960s London at the UFO Club, and rock at this point is still rigidly defined as, music to be played.
Right, you plug in, you play the hits, the audience claps. Simple.
Simple. But the MMR column highlights these audience testimonies from those early UFO Club gigs where people explicitly stated they weren't watching a band. They were, quote, melting into the space.
Melting into the space.
Yeah. So how were they achieving that kind of sensory takeover so early on? Like, what was the actual trick?
Well, they were employing these liquid light shows.
Yeah.
And it's really important to understand the physical mechanics of what that actually meant back in the 1960s.
Right, because no computers.
Exactly. They weren't using digital projectors or lasers yet. Technicians were actually taking glass plates, sandwiching these oil and water-based dyes between them, and placing them over the intense, just boiling heat of projector bulbs.
Oh, wow. So it's a literal physical reaction happening on the projector.
Yes. The heat would literally cause the liquids to boil and pulsate on the glass. And that projected these massive, shifting, amoeba-like colors all over the venue walls and all over the band members themselves, too.
That's incredible.
It completely destroyed the visual boundary between the stage and the audience.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's less like a standard concert and more like stepping inside a living, breathing organism, like a modern immersive art exhibit.
Exactly. The visual environment was completely symbiotic with the sound.
And the creative architect driving this initial sensory overload was their frontman, Syd Barrett. The column paints him as this creative nucleus, someone who married like a fairy tale, almost childlike sensibility with a deeply unsettling, heavy undercurrent.
He was the absolute core. And to understand the friction he was creating in the broader cultural landscape, you just have to look at their 1967 debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn.
Oh, the timing on that is just wild.
It really is. They were recording that record in the exact same studio facility where the Beatles were simultaneously making Sgt. Pepper's.
It's incredible to think about that juxtaposition. You have these two massive forces in British music literally passing each other in the hallways. But their philosophies couldn't be further apart.
Not at all.
You've got the Beatles in one room meticulously building the ultimate cathedral of pop structure, and Barrett's band is in the other room actively dismantling the very idea of structure.
Precisely. Barrett was living that deconstruction. But, it came at a profound psychological cost.
Yeah.
The MMR piece shares some pretty visceral anecdotes about his behavior during this time. There was one gig where he reportedly walked on stage and played the entire set without changing a single guitar chord.
Wait, a single chord for the whole show?
Yeah, he just strummed one hypnotic droning chord for the entire duration of the gig.
That is, I mean, that's wild. And then there is the story of the Brilliantine Cream, which just sounds like a nightmare.
Oh, yeah.
He apparently put an entire tube of this thick hair cream onto his head right before walking out on stage. And as the intense heat of that lighting rig hit him, the cream literally melted. It dripped down and completely coated his face while he was trying to perform.
It is a striking, almost suffocating visual metaphor, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mind that is actively dissolving under the spotlight.
Wow.
The boundary pushing that made the music so immersive, it was the exact same force that was fracturing his reality.
Which leads to an incredibly difficult creative problem. His mental state deteriorated so rapidly that, well, he was gone by 1968.
Yeah, very fast.
So my question is, how does a band even survive losing the creative center of their universe just as they're taking off? You lose the guy who wrote all your psychedelic hits. How do you recover from that foundational collapse?
You survive by completely changing the rules of engagement. What's fascinating here is that Barrett's departure is the exact catalyst that forced the remaining four members to pivot.
Right, Roger Waters, Richard Wright, Nick Mason, and David Gilmour.
Exactly. They realized they couldn't rely on quirky 3-minute pop songs anymore. They had to transition their entire focus from traditional musical performance into what the MMR piece labels constructed music.
Constructed music, meaning the recording studio is no longer just a passive room where you capture a live gig. The studio itself becomes an instrument.
Yes, exactly. They started utilizing tape reversals, complex tape loops, and field recordings.
Which was so much harder back then.
Oh, absolutely. We have to remember what creating a tape loop actually required in the analog era. You couldn't just, click and drag a digital file on a screen.
Right.
They had to physically cut magnetic tape with a razor blade, splice the ends together with adhesive, and then physically spool that loop of tape around the microphone stands, stretched all the way down the studio hallway just to get a repeating rhythm.
That is just manual, painstaking architectural labor.
It really was.
And that labor is what birthed my absolute favorite detail from the source material. It talks about the song Echoes from their 1971 album Metal.
Oh, yes. The ping.
The ping. There is this highly distinct, incredibly atmospheric, echoing ping sound that completely anchors the track. And they didn't synthesize it. It was discovered purely by accident.
Just a microphone placed near a piano.
Right. And it captured this weird internal acoustic resonance.
It was a complete chance occurrence, born entirely from the raw acoustics of the instrument reacting with the room.
But instead of just shrugging it off as a weird audio artifact, they centered everything on it. Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about this architecturally. It's like a master chef building a 5-star dish around a kitchen mistake, or finding a single, perfectly resonant steel beam in a scrapyard and realizing you can construct a massive acoustic cathedral around that one frequency.
That's a great way to put it.
But I do want to push back on this approach for a second. By meticulously designing the sound this way, cutting tape with razor blades, engineering these pings, calculating every frequency, don't you inherently strip away the raw, spontaneous, sweaty energy that makes rock music fun in the first place? Doesn't it risk becoming sterile?
That is a very legitimate tension, and it's something purists at the time really struggled with. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, they weren't sterilizing rock. They were elevating it into a structural experience.
Okay, how so?
They were proving that music didn't have to just be a visceral gut reaction. By taking an element of pure chance, like that piano ping, and rigorously structuring it, they were actually laying the essential groundwork for modern electronic music and spatial audio design.
And they definitely weren't just confining this spatial design to the studio, right? The source outlines their live quadraphonic sound experiments.
Yes, the azimuth coordinator.
Yeah, they were placing massive speaker stacks in the four corners of the concert venues, and they used specialized joysticks at the mixing desk to literally pan the audio in a 360-degree circle around the room.
It's incredible.
So the sound isn't just hitting you in the face, it's physically wrapping around your back.
They were manipulating the physical geometry of the venue. They were dictating the space you were standing in. And once you master that level of three-dimensional audio construction, a standard song structure becomes incredibly limiting.
Right. A 3-minute track is simply no longer a big enough container for the ideas you're generating, which leads to the logical next step. And the MMR piece identifies this as a massive turning point in rock history.
1973.
1973, the release of The Dark Side of the Moon. This is where they take the entire album format and turn it into a single unified philosophical statement.
And the themes they were tackling were massive. I mean, time, madness, mortality, and capitalism.
And just to be clear for you listening, the source material explores their focus on capitalism completely neutrally. It frames it purely as an economic structure that the band was dissecting within their art, right alongside the flow of time and the fragility of the human mind.
Exactly. It was just part of the broader human experience they were analyzing.
But what is truly staggering is how they executed these abstract concepts mechanically in the studio. They didn't just play a somber chord progression to represent mortality,
Hmm.
they literally processed a drum kit to sound like a human heartbeat.
Think about the audio engineering required there. You don't just hit a drum and have it sound like a biological heart.
No.
You have to heavily pad the kick drum. You completely deaden the acoustic resonance, detune it, and aggressively manipulate the EQ to boost the low-end frequencies until it stops sounding like a musical instrument and starts feeling biological.
It's wild. And to explore commerce, they brought in actual physical cash registers. They recorded the mechanical sounds of coins clinking and paper tearing, and then spliced those sounds into a rigid, mathematical, rhythmic loop.
A literal loop of money.
Yeah. But the sequence that really highlights the analog nightmare they were operating in is the opening of the album dealing with the concept of time. They wanted the sound of ticking and chiming clocks.
Right. And in the early 1970s, you couldn't just pull up a sound library on a laptop.
No way.
They gathered numerous physical analog clocks.
Mm-hmm.
And to get them to synchronize on the recording, they had to record each clock separately, set up multiple tape machines, and literally try to hit play on all the machines at the exact same millisecond.
Just hoping the chimes hit the master tape simultaneously.
Exactly. If a finger slipped by a fraction of an inch, the entire sequence was out of time and just sounded chaotic.
It is an obsessive, almost maddening level of technical control. But here's where I get hung up. When you are meticulously syncing analog clocks and processing drums to sound like cardiovascular systems, all to explore themes of madness and death, how does this not just collapse under its own weight?
It's a fair point.
With all these massive themes, how did this not just feel like a heavy, pretentious audio textbook for the listener?
Well, that is the absolute genius of their overarching methodology. If they had just written highly poetic, abstract lyrics about madness, it probably would have been pretentious.
Yeah.
But they grounded these massive concepts with raw, unpolished humanity. They walked around the studio with a microphone, interviewing regular people, roadies, doormen, anyone they could find, and they asked them incredibly heavy questions like, what is madness? Or what do you think of death?
And they wove those unscripted, spontaneous answers directly into these intensely calculated tracks.
Exactly. It brought the high-minded philosophy crashing back down to earth. The combination of hyper-engineered spatial audio and the unrehearsed voice of a random doorman, that's what made the album universally resonant. It sounded like the actual texture of real life.
It's brilliant. And we have to mention the iconic album cover art by Hypnosis, the prism with the white light beam refracting into a spectrum of color.
Oh, of course.
It is the ultimate visual shorthand for what we are discussing. The band was taking raw, white noise sound, breaking it down into its core frequencies, and reconstructing it into an entirely new, expanded environment.
It perfectly summarized their acoustic philosophy. But the progression outlined in the MMR column shows that eventually, even the grand canvas of the concept album wasn't big enough for them.
No, it wasn't. As we move into the late 70s, the narrative actually begins to spill out of the studio monitors. It actively starts conquering physical space.
This brings us to the 1979 release of The Wall.
Right.
If Dark Side was a universal exploration of human existence, The Wall was this intensely claustrophobic, deeply personal examination of isolation and oppression, largely driven by Roger Waters. And the crazy thing is, the massive success of their previous albums is exactly what triggered this new phase.
Yeah, the inciting incident is completely jarring. The source details how the band's massive success had them playing in these gargantuan stadiums during their In the Flesh tour.
Huge crowds.
Huge, rowdy crowds. They were lighting off fireworks, completely checked out from the meticulous spatial audio the band was trying to present. And the disconnect became so severe that Waters, who was just overwhelmed by alienation, actually leaned over the edge of the stage and spat on a fan in the front row.
It was a moment of profound ugliness.
Yeah.
And it severely shocked Waters himself. It forced him to confront the psychological barrier, the literal wall that had formed between him as a creator and the thousands of people who were supposedly there to connect with him.
But they didn't just write a metaphorical concept album about that barrier, they decided to manifest it physically.
They really did.
During the live tour for The Wall, they had technicians construct a massive physical wall out of cardboard bricks, scaling the entire width of the arena stage. They built it brick by brick while the band was playing, until by the second half of the show, the band was completely obscure. They were playing behind a wall.
It's an astonishing logistical feat. But more importantly, it's a profound psychological experiment on the audience.
And that's exactly what I want to dig into. Think about the irony here. A rock band builds a literal brick wall to block themselves from their paying fans as a way to comment on the lack of human connection. So what does this all mean? How does an audience even process a concert where the artists are actively physically shutting them out?
This raises an important question about the ultimate cost of total artistic control. Because it was hostile, the audience wasn't just passively watching a show about isolation. They were being actively subjected to it.
Right.
They were forced to confront the alienation themselves. The band's narrative completely conquered the physical space of the arena. Furthermore, they expanded this concept into a film adaptation directed by Alan Parker, merging stark animation with live action.
Proving that music could be a fully expanded visual medium.
Exactly.
But building an environment that massive and that hostile comes with collateral damage.
It does. That imposing physical wall going up on stage perfectly mirrored the psychological walls that were rapidly going up between the band members themselves. The uncompromising, singular vision required to execute this environment ultimately consumed them.
The stage design essentially became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The MMR column outlines how the internal fracturing during the 1980s finally hit a breaking point. Roger Waters officially left the group in 1985.
Right.
And he actually declared the band functionally over. He believed the creative nucleus was finished.
However, David Gilmour and the remaining members fundamentally disagreed. This led to fierce, highly publicized legal battles over who actually had the right to use the band's name.
And ultimately, Gilmour's faction retained the rights.
They did.
And they didn't just quietly fade away either. They returned in 1987 with the album A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Now, the source does note that they relied heavily on session musicians for this project, but what's critical is how they approached the live shows.
They went massive.
They completely doubled down on the grand scale of the production. We're talking giant circular projection screens, massive laser light arrays, and flying props. They just kept expanding the physical environment.
Meanwhile, Waters was entirely tied to the legacy of the environment he built. In 1990, he mounted a massive live performance of The Wall at the actual site of the Berlin Wall.
What a moment.
The truly monumental cultural moment that symbolized the end of the Cold War. The architecture of the music had literally mapped onto the geopolitics of the real world. And of course, there was the historic 2005 Live 8 reunion, bringing it all back together briefly.
So if we look at how fiercely they fought over the name in court, but then we look at what both factions went on to produce, I have a question for you. Didn't they both essentially prove that the band had evolved into something much bigger than just a few guys playing instruments? It seems like it stopped being a traditional rock band and became a methodology.
That is an incredibly astute way to look at it, and I think it's entirely accurate. The individuals may have splintered into different personal interpretations of the philosophy, but the core methodology, that commitment to creating deeply immersive, world-building environments, survived the fracturing.
Wow.
The column's conclusion makes this point beautifully. It highlights how their ideas heavily influenced ambient pioneers like Brian Eno. But more significantly, their methodology became the absolute blueprint for the modern concert industry. Giant LED screens, spatial audio, immersive installations. It all comes back to this.
Which brings us full circle. We started in a cramped, sweaty London club, watching a tragic frontman melt hair cream onto his face under bubbling oil projectors.
A long way from there.
A very long way. We moved into the obsessive razor blade splicing world of the analog studio, trying to synchronize mechanical clocks and engineer human heartbeats out of drum skins. And finally, we ended up in massive stadiums, watching actual walls collapse on stage while lasers cut through the physical space.
They completely transformed the medium.
They fundamentally rewrote the definition of a music experience. And to you listening right now, The very next time you walk into a major stadium concert and you are staring up at massive LED installations, feeling the meticulously designed surround sound thud in your chest, just remember, you are standing inside a spatial concept that was engineered by this exact group decades ago.
It really is wild to think about, and I'll leave you this final thought to mull over. The spatial manipulation hasn't stopped, it's just become personal.
Oh, yeah.
The next time you put on your high-end, noise-canceling headphones to block out the chaotic noise of the street or the subway, ask yourself, are you just passively listening to a track? Or are you willingly stepping into a carefully engineered environment specifically designed to manipulate your perception of time, space, and reality?
That is the perfect question to leave hanging in the air. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep exploring, and we'll catch you on the next one.